Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, 1818, is the first fully achieved science fiction novel. An exemplar of the Romantic movement, it exploits both the legend of the Golem and the tradition of Faust. It reflects the philosophic struggles with valorizing the ego that go back to classical myth and with the destabilizing possibilities of new knowledge that go back to the story of the fall from Eden. In addition, Frankenstein offers a structural innovation within the narrower tradition of Gothicism, the plausibility-seeking preface, that, in a sense, creates modern science fiction. Told as a set of complexly nested narratives, Frankenstein constantly explores the relationship between the individual and society. Science is not the subject of the novel, but its motive. Its emblem, the monster, does not represent science, but the perversion of the natural by the egotistical quest for knowledge. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was only 19 when she finished writing Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster is an icon for science beyond human control. Ironically, the word itself has also escaped control. Mary Shelley called her experimenting protagonist, Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. The monster in the book gets no name. In scores of films, starting in 1910, Frankenstein's monster has stalked the world. And today at Halloween, if a child comes with a mask showing Boris Karloff as the monster from the famous 1931 movie, we don't say, "Ah, you are Frankenstein's monster." We say, "Ah, you are Frankenstein." But in that classic movie, Frankenstein himself is a doctor, and in the many films that follow, he is often doctor or baron. In fact, however, in the novel, we have a crazed undergraduate. The monster in the films becomes an implacably brutal, murderous creature. At the film's climax, man and monster are attacked by vengeful villagers swirling up the mountain to destroy the castle and its inhabitants. But as I say, the novel is quite different. Victor Frankenstein is egotistical. As an undergraduate, he tells himself he would be Prometheus, the bringer of great gifts, fire in the case of the Greek god Prometheus, to mankind. But he shuns the very humanity he claims to want to help. He goes off on his own, despite the advice of his friends and family, to pursue his studies, to make life again. The innately noble monster is the most gifted character in the book. The scene on the ice of the glacier near Chamonix, at which the monster confronts his maker and explains to him his own story about the welter of different sensations he had as he first came back to life, as he talks to him about wanting community, as he asks, "Please do not let me be entirely alone, make for me a bride." His eloquence, his appeal to natural ethics, his understanding of real society is extraordinary. That monster, as he tells us, is able to live on raw berries and nuts. He's able to survive extremes of cold and heat. He is the noblest, most capable character in the book. And in the book, there are no villagers. Yet, the mythic power of the story resonates as well with its audience in 1931 as it did in 1818. In 1818, at a point at which science is coming forward in human consciousness, we see the scientist withdrawing from community as a danger. In 1931, the doctor or the baron is expressed through his doppelganger, his creation, as interfering with the lives of those poor people at the base of the hill. Filmed in the midst of the Depression, we have taken this myth of the antisocial and made it an emblem of the futility of life of the good, solid working Americans who were not able to survive in those times, while the fat cats on the hill certainly did. Because of that malleability, it's easy for us to understand why we could say that Frankenstein is, in some sense, especially in our technological age, the essential modern myth. And it grew out of the thrilling heart of Romanticism. In mid-June 1816, at the Villa Diodati outside Geneva, there was a famous evening when Percy Bysshe Shelley, one of the founding Romantic poets, Mary Shelley, then his mistress, eventually his wife, Lord Byron, another of the founding Romantic poets, Clairmont, stepsister of Mary Shelley and mistress to Lord Byron, and J.W. Polidori, Lord Byron's personal physician, all challenged each other to write ghost stories. These people had been reading ghost stories and decided to create them. In multiple senses of the term, these people actually lived romantic lives. Percy, as I say, was living with Mary, but his wife, Harriet, was in England, who, while Percy and Mary were away, committed suicide by walking into a pond in a park in London. Percy and Mary consecrated that event by marrying. Byron was living with Claire, but his wife in England was Anne, who took a lover rather than committing suicide. William Godwin, Mary's father, was a famous advocate of free love. Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, who died soon after Mary's own birth, was a famous feminist. Godwin raised his wife's illegitimate first child, Fanny Imlay, who also may have been pregnant at the time of her suicide, by Percy Shelley. Byron published his failed vampire story, motivated by the challenge that romantic evening, as Fragment of a Story in 1819. Polidori, whom none of the others liked, is unacknowledged in the prefaces to Frankenstein, and yet he wrote, perhaps using Byron's discarded materials, the first vampire novel in English, called The Vampire, published in 1819, and starring a Lord Ruthven, a vampire who is obviously a caricature of Byron himself. The most important result of that meeting, that romantic evening, was Frankenstein, Mary's response to that June challenge. Although Frankenstein is romantic, it draws on many important traditions. The classic myths of Prometheus and Hyperborea motivate respectively Victor, Frankenstein, and Robert Walton, the explorer who transmits Victor's story. The myth of Prometheus is the myth of someone who wants to steal fire from the gods and is forever punished thereafter. The myth of Hyperborea is an ancient Greek myth that says, there is a range of mountains. As we approach this range of mountains going further to the north, things get colder and colder and colder, but when we cross that range to Hyperborea, the land above the north wind, we come to a land of eternal warmth and sunshine. Just as Victor Frankenstein is seeking to bring fire to humanity, a new kind of fire that will reanimate the dead, Robert Walton seeks to prove the reality of the Hyperborea myth. Victor Frankenstein is found on an ice floe, almost dead in the Arctic, and is brought aboard Robert Walton's exploratory ship. It is from Robert's report that we get Victor's story. They are fellow explorers, each trying to fulfill an ancient Greek legend. Victor is in many ways a version of Faust, a legendary and literary character based on a real 16th century German conjurer. Many stories about this man's scholarly abilities and magical abilities were false, but any such stories began to be magnetically associated with that character because enough of them appeared to be true. The character of Faust turns into the protagonist of one of the greatest romantic works of all time, Goethe's Faust. He's also the main character of Marlowe's tragical history of Dr. Faustus, and it is that Faust, that version of Faust, that truly underlies Victor Frankenstein, because in Marlowe's version of Faust, at the end, when he looks up into the sky and says, "One drop of blood from that firmament would save me," no Christ's blood comes down. The deal he's made with Mephistopheles to have 24 years of infernal power has now come due, and the trapdoor opens in the stage. Mephistopheles reaches up, and Faust is drawn down to hell for all eternity. In Goethe's Faust, the love of a good woman redeems the character. It's Marlowe's English Faust that underlies the tale of Victor Frankenstein. The monster recalls the 17th century Jewish legend of the Golem. The Golem is a man made of clay who is animated by having the tetragrammaton, the sacred 4 letters that are God's personal name, never to be spoken by Jews, but pronounced in English, Jehovah, or Yahweh, inscribed on his forehead or put on a piece of paper and inserted into his mouth, which then animates him, and the huge animated clay man is to protect the Jews in the ghetto. That animation of clay is an earthly, human recreation of God lifting Adam out of the clay. The name Adam refers to a color red, and red is the color of the clay. The word Adam, in a sense, then means the clay from which he is made. The religious references ring throughout Frankenstein. Paradise Lost by John Milton is the 17th century epic perhaps most gloriously expressing Christianity in the English literary heritage. It gives the epigraph to Frankenstein. "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" This is Adam complaining to God, for Adam, having been made man with his own free will, was able to fall from grace. He did not ask for this, nor did Victor's creature ask to be made unique in all the world. In fact, Milton provides not only the epigraph, but also the reading list for the monster, which includes Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, and the Sorrows of Verta. Plutarch's Lives is an ancient work that tells us of the noble Greeks and Romans in order to give us the exemplar of what should be the way people function. The Sorrows of Verta is a work by Goethe that was enormously popular. It tells the story of a man who fails at love. His inability to find love with the woman he likes moves him so that he commits suicide by walking into the water, as had Harriet Shelley. The book was published in a quite distinctive yellow binding, and after the publication of The Sorrows of Young Verta, there was actually a wave of suicides that swept Europe, where people were fished out of rivers and lakes, found with copies of the yellow-bound Verta in their pockets. This ultimate death for lack of love is something we will see again at the end of Frankenstein. Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, The Sorrows of Young Verta. This is the reading list, but there is more to it than that. When the monster talks about what it means to have to walk away without a wife, he says to Victor, "And now, with the world before me, whither should I bend my steps?" This, I think, is an allusion to the famous last lines of Paradise Lost. Adam and Eve have been expelled from the garden. They feel distraught. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. and then they turned their back to Eden. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and providence their guide. They hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. And now, with the world before me, whither should I bend my steps? The monster is very literate, and he understands that, unlike Adam, he has not only fallen away from his Creator, but must live in that condition alone. The monster is, in many ways, the archetype of modern alienation. The plot of Frankenstein recalls that of Beauty and the Beast. Beauty, after all, is able to see past the beast's ugly exterior and recognize that within this fairy tale creature is a man of nobility. Clairmont, the second wife of William Godwin, and hence the stepmother of Mary Shelley, but the mother by a previous marriage, Mrs. Clairmont, the mother of Claire Clairmont, Mary's stepsister. Mrs. Clairmont, the second wife of William Godwin, was a publisher who published a verse translation of Beauty and the Beast called A Rough Exterior with a Tender Heart. It's clear then that these fairy tale beginnings, traditions, are also part of this story. In fact, Frankenstein is the story of a creature who is so ugly that he immediately repels people. His own creator thinks of him instantly as an enemy, and yet we who see him from the inside know that he is the most noble and elegant creature in the book. Frankenstein is the first fully formed science fiction novel. What exactly does that mean? Well, first of all, we see that both Victor and the noble savage monster have a kind of self-education. And this recalls the romanticism of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in works like Émile talk about the way in which a human being left to its own devices will naturally be good, hence the notion of noble savage. When Victor's monster first looks in the water and sees his own reflection, he is horrified because he automatically, nobly, has a savage, true sense of visual aesthetics. However, civilization perverts that natural nobility that the savage has. Rousseau romantically sees humans in a state of nature as perfect, while those who have been civilized are not. Victor's monster begins in nature, but then he approaches civilization and is ultimately made into the murderer. Gothicism is a variety of romanticism. It begins with early works like Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard, in which the speaker contemplates the possibility that all these unknown dead people may be each a mute, inglorious Milton, someone we could have remembered for the nobility of his language and thought, but we do not, because he never actually wrote. But the Gothic reaches full form, this romantic concern for the ego, for death, for heightened emotions, in a book by Horace Walpole called The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764. This book has as its subtitle a Gothic story. And it's called Gothic because it's set in a castle. It refers, the word Gothic, to Gothic architecture. This story begins with a man waiting for his son to come across the courtyard for his marriage. He's late. The bride is waiting. They look across the courtyard, and there they see within it a 40-foot-high helmet that has somehow fallen from the sky. Out from beneath the helmet stick the legs of the sun. Clearly the supernatural is at play here, and what will the man do? Well, the man wants to join his principality with the neighboring principality. Having just lost his son, he decides he's going to marry the girl and spends the rest of the novel chasing her around the castle. This idea of the Gothic refers to the grotesque British ideas about Roman Catholicism and Southern European culture, having to do with myth, curses, witchcraft, and so on. But, as is always the case within a given genre, as it develops, aesthetic fatigue begins to set in, and people have to do something more with it. Anne Radcliffe, in works like The Mysteries of Udolpho, added a fantastic twist to the Gothic to produce what's called Gothic expliqué, that is, the explained Gothic, something you might more easily think of as the Scooby-Doo ending. You know, everything looks strange, the pictures have eyes, they follow you, there are these curses, there are ghosts, and at the end, somebody takes off a mask and it turns out just to be old Mr. Wilson, the neighbor down the street. Well, in the Gothic expliqué, not only do you have one fantastic element happen after another, but at the end, everything is revealed as having been natural. That naturalization is a diachronic, diametric reversal of the ground rules of the narrative world, a complete shift that happens through time, and thus the natural becomes yet more fantastic. What Anne Radcliffe did was revive our interest in the Gothic by giving that explanation, Gothic expliqué. Now, there are other ways to make the genre lively. For example, Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey, published in 1818, just like Frankenstein, made the Gothic more lively by ironizing it, but Shelley did something crucial. What she did was move Anne Radcliffe's naturalizing ending to the beginning of the novel. The novel begins with a preface that says, "The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin," that's Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, "and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence." Not of impossible occurrence. She's claiming plausibility for the fantastic against the background of science. She's writing a Gothic novel, but she's moving the ending to the front. She does this so as to go and reveal the truth of the elementary principles of human nature. As in Emma Zunz, the details may be wrong, but the essence rang true. And she uses, to justify her literary approach, reference to Shakespeare's The Tempest, a great play in which spirits are brought under the control of a man who at the end says, "I will drown my books," which he does. And he, Prospero, is able to go back to Italy, while Faust, in Marlowe's Faust, says, "I will burn my books," but it's too late. The science fiction genre we know today really comes from this maneuver on the part of Mary Shelley to take the Gothic expliqué and move it to the beginning of the novel, to create that plausibility. In this particular novel, how can we understand science fiction and the work itself more deeply? We've already noticed that the monster himself has become, in part through the movies, the visible emblem of Frankenstein. If we think what represents this novel, Frankenstein, it's the image of the monster. Well, he is nameless, but he is called by a set of words which recur again and again, sometimes all of them within the space of half a page. He is called wretched, miserable creature, monster, fiend, and enemy. Wretched comes from the Old English word meaning exile, someone forced outside of the community. Miserable means worthy of pity, miserabilis. Creature means the made one. Monster has a disputed etymology. It is either from monere, to warn, or mostrare, to show. In either case, the Latin monstrum is something that makes us look to see what will be happening. It may be a warning or an emblem of something good to come, but in our use, it is always of something bad to come. Fiend is cognate with foe. An enemy, for those who speak Spanish, know that it is from enemigo, the opposite of amigo. If amigo, friend, is the one who is loved, the enemigo is the one who is anti-loved. When Victor sees his creation, he automatically calls him things: wretched, miserable creature, monster, fiend, enemy. The monster is the emblem of the book. The book is about what happens when a scientist develops knowledge which, in this case, in the body of his doppelganger, the creature, leaves the control of the community. And so he becomes, wanting community, murderous. The book is, in fact, written in epistolary form. That is, it's composed of a set of letters. And this form reinforces Victor's father's own insight about what's going on with Victor. The novel begins with a letter from Robert Walton, that explorer, to his sister Margaret Saville back in England. Of course, he can't mail the letter because he's stuck in the ice floes in the Arctic. Nonetheless, he writes and writes and writes. As he writes, he meets Victor. Victor tells him a story which he incorporates into his letters. Victor's story includes the story of his meetings with the monster. And so we have the monster's narrations and so on. All of these displayed within a series of letters written by Robert. Robert, in other words, even though prevented from reaching his family, reaches out toward his family. But when Victor, who has refused to communicate with his family, is finally confronted by his friend Henri Clerval, who has gone off to meet him, Clerval brings with him a message from his father and says, "Your father tells you that as you have failed to write to him, he understands you to have been derelict in all of your obligations to the community." And the father, knowing nothing of trying to create the monster, is in fact correct. Community plays out in many ways. While Victor does not listen to community and dies, Robert, confronted with the possibility of mutiny by the sailors on his exploratory boat, understands their wisdom and turns back. Was Hyperborea discovered? No. But will society go on? Yes. Community is visible in the filial relations that Victor has with his father, in the relation of Robert to his shipmates, in the relations of friends like Henri Clerval, who winds up being killed by the monster because of Victor's intransigence, even in the relations of spouses. The monster says to Victor, after Victor has destroyed the half-made bride for the monster, "I will be with you on your wedding night." Victor is such an egotist that he thinks that the monster is after him. And so on his wedding night, he goes off to try to prevent the monster from reaching him. In fact, when he comes back to the boudoir, he discovers his bride dead. What the monster is doing is exacting on Victor the revenge the monster that Victor had exacted on the monster. What the monster wants is community. We have in this book a series of doppelgangers. Robert is a doppelganger for Victor, and we see what happens when you do or do not take an attitude towards science that responds to community. Victor is a doppelganger for the monster, and we see what happens when you do or do not allow your desire for power to run loose. The book is told as a series of nested narratives. Robert reports Victor, reports the monster, who himself reports the tale of the de Lacy cottage, which he sits by and watches and learns to read by watching them read those three books, Plutarch's Lives, The Sorrows of Verta, and Paradise Lost. And in the de Lacy's cottage, he sees played out yet another story, the story of Felix and Safie, Felix being one of the children of the de Lacy family. Felix and Safie are lovers who are promised the ability to marry by Safie's father, who is a Muslim. But at the end, the father says no, and so they must flee for their lives. At the center of this set of nested narratives there is a story of familial betrayal. This novel is not a warning against science, but against science in the hands of an egotist alienated from the restraining wisdom of community. To test the relevance of this admonition, I invite you to read today's newspaper.